Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Vital Dissent. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 251. Show notes may be found at vitaldissent.com/251. Also, I am the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Libertarian Institute, so you can check out my work at libertarianinstitute.org for my work and the work of my colleagues, but my work is at libertarianinstitute.org/Patrick. In this episode, I want to go back to an article that I wrote with Will Porter. Will Porter was the editor on this article, but also I wrote it with Connor Freeman, contributing to large parts of the article. And I kind of presented this, it was published this fall, presented this as my magnum opus or whatever you would call it on China. Just trying to compile all of our work in one place for people who don't really know much of anything about the background of our new Cold War with China and how it is supposed to be the U.S. empire's next step. That now we're dealing with Ukraine, but ultimately the main goal is China. We're gearing up for war. It's been called, quote unquote, the big one. And in the context of this, we saw a lot of libertarians going on the Tim Pool show, and people who have listened to my show since at least 2020, I believe, since at least before the beginning of COVID. So maybe for the last 3 or 4 years, Jesus Christ, 3 or 4 years now, will know that I've been a pretty vocal critic of Tim Pool. But I thought, you catch more, what is the saying? You catch more flies with honey, or you catch more bees with honey than with vinegar. And this was my kind of, it was my effort to have a congenial, call Tim Pool out, tell him that he's wrong, but not be an ass about it, which I think I have been a little bit in the past. But, I think that you're more convincing and you're more, of course, being an attorney, you're more persuasive when you are, nicer about things, more approachable. People consider what you say more when you're more diplomatic about things. But I thought it'd be useful because, to be honest, I've really been struggling with trying to manage my firm and my practice, but also just with motivation and trying not to get too swept up into politics and some mental health stuff. It's just been difficult. I got a baby on the way and things are kind of tough right now to be engaged and to be putting out content. Been doing it for 6 years now. Sometimes it just gets frustrating. But I thought that the reason I wrote this piece was so that libertarians and people in libertarian leadership would hopefully read it and could use it to go on Tim Pool's show and tell him these things. Or, in the odd event that I ever got an invite to go on Timcast, this is what I would say. And that's kind of how I framed the entire article. So I think that it's a great starting point. It is a bit lengthy, but this is a topic that is so multifaceted and deep and complicated. But at the same time, it's kind of simple. So if you can take a narrative and you can articulate everything in this in some talking points, which is what people in leadership are good at, having those talking points, but being able to back it up in facts and really demonstrate a command of the subject matter, I think is really important. So for those of you who are listening to the audio version only, my article is called What Tim Pool Should Know About Our Cold War with China. And it goes like this. So since September 2020, several notable libertarians have established a rapport with political commentator, journalist, and YouTuber Tim Pool. These interactions have resulted in a string of appearances by prominent libertarians on Pool's daily talk show, Timcast IRL. A few of these people, some libertarians have really become a staple of Tim Pool's show. And I'm thinking of, Luke Rudkowski, who, he is kind of a loose change, we are change kind of 9/11 truther person, has really become like a co-host of the show. Michael Malice is like a frequent guest on the show. And there's some Phil Labonte from All That Remains is styles himself to be a Ron Paul libertarian. Although I think that he's one of those conservative libertarians, someone who is a conservative first but also a libertarian, like someone who's likes Ron Paul. So, but I say Tim's willingness to host influential libertarians offers a continuing opportunity to present his sizable audience with facts often missing from his own foreign policy analysis, especially regarding America's relationship with China. For example, Tim deployed most of his China talking points in a recent interview. Now, this was from last summer, but he said, they've got concentration camps right now where they're raping women, they're forcing abortions on them, and they're in concentration camps. They're expanding rapidly around the world. They're doing exploration and land purchases in the United States, in South America, and Africa. They have the Belt and Road Initiative. They're doing so much that is expanding their power. The South China Sea, Taiwan, not to mention the concentration camps and the skirmishes on the border with India. If given the opportunity to sit down and talk with Tim Pool, this is what I would tell him and his audience. So in previous articles that I've written at the Libertarian Institute, I've addressed this Chinese land purchases in the United States. And among foreign landowners in the US, China owns less than 5% of the total foreign-owned land in the United States. And it's unclear what the metric is in terms of, like, do countries themselves own the land? Like, do sovereign states own the land? Or is the metric foreign nationals owning land in the United States? It's really unclear. But in terms of, like, the overall percentage, like, China's not even, of the countries that own farmland in the US, China's not even in the top 3 or 4, I believe. I mean, they own less than 4%. So there's that fact, all this scary talk about China purchasing all the farmland, purchasing land adjacent to U.S. military installations and stuff like that. It's really just emblematic of the fear mongering that goes on behind all this. So, like the Chinese spy balloon narrative, everyone calls it even normies call it, it was a Chinese spy balloon, right? Well, that was never, ever proven. There's no actual evidence that was ever offered up proving or even going towards the idea that it was a Chinese spy balloon. It's just, that's what the media carried away with. And now everyone just says Chinese spy balloon. So the largest military buildup since World War II is the first section here. So we start off with a quote from Lew Rockwell because I think it's so prescient, but it's also, paleo-libertarians and kind of like post-libertarian types, or let's say Hoppian libertarians who are pro-Ukraine, which is kind of a confusing development. But one of the reasons why we included this quote from Lew Rockwell is because he's such a prominent he's such a prominent paleo-libertarian, someone who is incredibly right-wing. And it's among the right-wing that you usually find this fear and hatred of China festers primarily. But Lew Rockwell gets it. He's an OG, he's a badass, and he's not afraid of China. So we included that. He sees what's going on. He says in 2014, clearly the empire is targeting China. The U.S. seeks to encircle China and make it bow down before the hegemon. The increasing prosperity and freedom of China threatens the empire's self-image. I continue. Tim Pool and populist Republicans both claim the Democratic Party is owned by China, accusing their liberal opponents, chief amongst them China Joe Biden, of being too soft on Beijing's communist government. However, a brief look at recent Democratic policies reveals the party has been far from friendly towards the People's Republic and has worked in tandem with the GOP to pursue the same aggressive strategy. So you always see this narrative among the right that is so troublesome, is that China owns Joe Biden, or that Joe Biden is weak, that he's soft, that he's feckless, that if only and this is the implication, is that if only he were tougher, if only he were more aggressive, then we wouldn't have this problem. If only China had done what Trump should have done, and I've heard Tim Pool talk about this, is that, Trump would have threatened to nuke Moscow, and therefore he would have prevented the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, by telling Putin, if you do this, I will nuke Moscow. And that overly aggressive macho stance is supposed to somehow be better than what Joe Biden appears to be, which is this out to lunch, senile old man who can't tie his shoes, but is somehow supposed to be confronting China. And this is such a dangerous rhetoric because, again, it encourages Biden and the Biden administration to be more aggressive, to prove this narrative wrong, and kind of calls him a pussy into posturing and being more aggressive. But the most troublesome part is that it really ignores what the reality of U.S. policy is towards China. And that policy is hyper aggressive. If you look at the actual facts that we go through here, our strategy towards China, the concrete objective steps that we've taken are hyper aggressive. Continuing on, in 2011, the Obama administration launched its Asia Pivot, the largest military buildup since World War II, aiming to create what then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton dubbed, quote, America's Pacific Century. So this really is a continuation. It's a bipartisan cross-administration strategy that began in earnest under Obama. And of course, there are a bunch of links here to back up everything that we say in this article. The Asia Pivot saw the Pentagon station 2/3 of its air and naval forces in areas surrounding China, where Washington maintains hundreds of bases and military installations. Obama's successor, Donald Trump, fully embraced the shift to the Pacific, with his Pentagon issuing a national defense strategy in 2018 declaring a refocus from the Middle East counterterrorism to, quote, great power competition with the likes of Russia and China. Now, I covered this NDS in my first large piece for the Libertarian Institute, which was called, I don't remember. Oh, The Danger of Great Power Competition with Russia and China. And I can't remember when I came out with that. Right here, June 4th, 2021. So I would encourage everyone to read that too, because this was the first article where I really focused on this whole problem and I identified it the first time I wrote about these issues. So much like Obama, Trump spent billions building up the U.S. military presence in the Indo-Pacific, stoking Beijing's ire with regular, quote, freedom of navigation missions and other shows of force in Chinese claimed waters. Joe Biden has carried through and even doubled down on many of the same policies since taking office, reaffirming both Obama's pivot eastward and Trump's desire to, quote, confront great powers on the world stage. Military operations in China's near abroad have only increased under Biden's watch, while his administration has repeatedly declared the U.S. is in, quote, extreme competition with the PRC, the People's Republic of China. Last year, Biden sent aircraft carrier strike groups into the South China Sea no less than 10 times, the first occurring just 4 days into his term, and ordered nonstop deployments of U.S. Navy surveillance vessels in the region. By November 2021, Biden's military had flown more than 2,000 sorties over the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Yellow Sea, more than doubling the number conducted under Trump in 2020. Now we have all these escalations over Taiwan, like the U.S. sending more Marines to go train the Taiwanese military. You have Tsai Ing-wen, the Taiwanese prime minister or president, coming to the United States and meeting with high-level U.S. officials. I think the Speaker of the House, I think it was Kevin McCarthy, that she met in person. And I'm not sure if McCarthy went over to Taiwan like he was planning on doing. Like I said in the beginning of the episode, I've been a little out of the loop lately, just because of circumstances. But that kind of visit, being the type of thing that sparked the third Taiwan Strait crisis in the 90s, when then Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui visited the United States and gave a speech at Cornell University. In the speech, he talked about Taiwanese independence and, was greeted with U.S. officials when he landed in, I believe it was in California or Hawaii for a refueling of his plane. But this was a big deal, and it basically started off a military standoff between the U.S. and China, where there were several barrages of rockets that were fired in the direction of Taiwan. Of course, we have Nancy Pelosi's visit occurring in August of this year, setting off a simulated blockade and, increasing bringing basically a new era of militarization into the strait. We'll talk about Taiwan a bit later, but this is just a ramping up and a continuation of that same policy. Washington is now spending more on its sprawling national security apparatus and globe-spanning empire than ever, despite perpetual cries of underfunding from hawks in both parties and the military itself. After 2 decades of waste in the Middle East, the new justification for ever greater defense, in quotes, outlays was stated succinctly by Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall during a speech last year. Quote, China, China, and China. Though such hostile policies appear to have gone unnoticed by Tim Pool and Biden's GOP detractors, China itself has noted the escalating tensions under the current administration. Less than 4 months after Biden assumed office, the Chinese Defense Ministry was already sounding alarms about ramped up U.S. military operations, claiming to have observed a 20% spike in naval reconnaissance missions and a 40% increase in surveillance flights in China's backyard. In recent segments, Pool has correctly warned against nuclear escalation between the US and Russia over Ukraine, but at the same time, he does not recognize the same pattern of American escalation with China. Indeed, the US is further nuclearizing the Asia-Pacific region through the AUKUS military pact, newly formed between Washington, London, and Canberra, as yet another way to counter the PRC. Now, that would be the Australia and Canberra. I don't know if that's how you pronounce their capital or if it is their capital. This part wasn't written by me. This is Connor Freeman. So as yet another way to counter the PRC. Under the deal, the U.S. will provide nuclear submarine technology to Australia, whose government is following America's lead in its quest to face down Beijing. Ostensibly, the vessels will not be armed with nuclear weapons. However, China is unlikely to take the word of the West on the matter, given the sheer destructive capability of a single nuclear-equipped sub, which could basically, Noam Chomsky talks about this. So, as Professor Noam Chomsky recently warned, one U.S. submarine can destroy almost 200 cities anywhere in the world with its nuclear weapons. Just one. The United States is sending a fleet of these nuclear submarines to Australia. That's the AUKUS deal. The right measure is not increasing provocation, increasing the threat of an accidental development which could lead to devastating, even virtually terminal nuclear war. But that's the direction the Biden administration is following. And just a note on deterrence here versus, because everyone says, oh, well, what we tried to do in Ukraine was deter Putin from invading by supplying them with weapons, bringing Ukraine closer into NATO, taking all these steps like Trump sent Javelin missiles, anti-tank missiles, which is a step even Obama wouldn't take, doing all these things, nuclear, the alliance itself, doing all these nuclear exercises, deploying military assets close to Russia is meant to deter them from taking action. But in reality, we see that this behavior actually provokes them. And, you have the same kind of voices that are saying, well, the problem with Ukraine is that we didn't deter Putin enough from invading. So what we need to do with something like Taiwan is to, deter even more by doing even more, which is sending more weapons, bringing Taiwan closer under the U.S. umbrella, the U.S. defense, in quotes, umbrella, training their soldiers, selling them more weapons, granting them more weapons, being more active in the South China Sea and flying more patrols in the area and spy planes and sailing more warships through the Taiwan Strait. That's obviously how we're going to deter them. But if you look at what China does and what they say they are doing, the reasons they give for doing what they do, which is kind of stepping up their military presence, spending more money on their military, having more military exercises, stepping up their rhetoric. The reason they give for doing that is because of U.S. provocations. That's what they say. So, of course, there's people who won't believe anything that China says just because they're China and because of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party. They don't believe anything that China says. I think only a fool doesn't listen to what their enemy is saying. So the reason they say that they're doing all these things is they cite U.S. escalation, which, they say will lead to some kind of conflict if this continues. So there's no real sign that, you could say that by providing weapons to Taiwan, we are deterring an invasion, which I think to some level, that might be true if you make it more costly to China to actually conduct an invasion. That it could have the potential of, in a way, deterring it just by common sense, saying, oh, well, Chinese officials, military officials, they did a calculation. They think that it would take 1.2 million soldiers to invade Taiwan and to subjugate it, and it would cost X amount of assets, of military assets. And it could have these effects. Sure, if it's too costly, it might help to deter an invasion, but also it provides other perverse incentive, like shortening the timeline. So if they believe that in 10 years, Taiwan and the United States will be much stronger than they are right now, well, if they had settled on a military invasion of Taiwan as being the way to solve this situation, then their timeline shortens. And that is a way of provoking an invasion. And also there's, saving face on the world stage if the U.S. continually upends them by participating in these provocative exercises. It seems like that's just escalatory on both sides in a tit-for-tat situation. So just a note on that. In his first congressional address, Biden boasted that he told Chinese President Xi Jinping that the United States, quote, will maintain a strong military presence in the Indo-Pacific, just as we do with NATO in Europe. Thus, Washington's Western allies have earnestly joined in on the Asia pivot as well, with German, French, British, and Canadian warships also sailing waters in China's near abroad in 2021. This year, NATO, the quote defensive alliance, targeted China in its new strategic concept document, accusing the country of posing a quote systemic challenge to the Euro-Atlantic security. So you have, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization being a defensive alliance that is primarily concerned with Europe, really turning into this globe-spanning police force, extending, its reach all the way from the North Atlantic to the South Pacific, which just, I don't know, it just kind of is self-parody at this point. But really you see these same forces, the same forces that have encouraged and provoked this war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, are purposefully prolonging it. Also, those same people being involved in provoking China to invade Taiwan. And somehow you have, Republicans, populist Republicans, who are rightfully opposing Ukraine, and in some cases, heroically so, not really understanding that those same people who are behind the war in Ukraine are also encouraging this war in China, or escalation in China. Against China, rather. So the UK's newly appointed Prime Minister Liz Truss, now she's not the Prime Minister anymore, but she has openly stated her readiness to order, quote, global annihilation through a nuclear exchange, reviving atomic brinksmanship not seen since the height of hostilities with the USSR. Illustrating a two-front Cold War mentality, she has been among the most belligerent Western officials in her rhetoric against Moscow, while demanding that NATO take a much larger role confronting China in the Asia-Pacific. As Dave DeCamp, news editor at antiwar.com, has written, quote, Truss has also been hawkish in her rhetoric against China and has called for a quote, global NATO that is capable of defending Taiwan and the broader Asia-Pacific region. She's expected to be confrontational with Beijing and will reportedly classify China as a, quote, threat to British national security for the first time. For the first time, notably. So here's where I took over on the article. The Taiwan Tripwire is the section title. All of the above embodies the U.S. shift to great power competition with China. However, the most significant tripwire for war is Washington's increasingly bellicose Taiwan policy, the true nature of which Tim Pool omits from his analysis. In a video posted July 28, 2022, Tim Pool rightfully warned that Nancy Pelosi's then planned trip to Taiwan could provoke a war. He then flippantly declared the government of Taiwan to be the, quote, true government of China, an incredibly hawkish statement which trivializes a complex and dangerous geopolitical situation while implicitly promoting the regime, while implicitly promoting regime change in Beijing. So this was kind of like a throwaway line that Tim Pool had in his analysis on this segment. And I actually have it timestamped, so I'm going to try and bring it up here. Here he says it.
Chinese leader Xi Jinping has stated repeatedly that China must reunify with Taiwan, which it considers a breakaway province. You know, personally, I consider Taiwan to be the true government of China, and China was taken over by communists. But I digress.
So I don't know if he's being serious there. He's kind of joking, but at the same time, like saying something like that is first of all, it's not a position that someone in the United States really has any business taking. And it really kind of flies in the face of history, especially since U.S. policy has turned to de-recognize the Republic of China in Taiwan and has instead turned to recognize the PRC, the CCP, mainland China, as being the legitimate government of China. So I don't know if Tim Pool, I don't know if he really understands that. I haven't heard him talk about it in detail, but it does seem like he has kind of a, I don't know, somewhat of an understanding, at least enough to know that there was a civil war and there was a government in exile in Taiwan. But anyways, I just thought it was a throwaway line that really, I don't know, wasn't trivialized a complex and dangerous geopolitical situation while implicitly promoting regime change in Beijing. So I wrote that. That's what I think about it. Even while acknowledging the provocative nature of the trip, Tim Pool ultimately praised Pelosi's intent to visit Taipei. He says, I don't know if this is the right thing for Nancy Pelosi to do. I want to say I really despise Nancy Pelosi, but I respect this. I absolutely respect this. Standing with Taiwan, I respect. It's a bold move. I think the U.S. should be speaking up in defense of Taiwan. To a certain degree, we don't want war with China, but it looks like we're on a dangerous track, and no matter what we do, Taiwan will fall to China. So he said this later in the video. I don't have a timestamp to that, but that's a direct quote. I went through, I transcribed it directly from that July 28th video where he said that. But I don't understand that, like, this is so emblematic of like the establishment foreign policy view, is that cross aisles, it's a bipartisan consensus of what the policy should be. And it's like they hate each other, but where they come together and approve of someone from across the aisles is when they have the most repugnant policy possible when it comes to foreign policy. It's just like, I'll fight with Nancy Pelosi all day long, but when she does something that is completely establishment deep state, like standing with Taiwan or going to visit Taiwan provocatively, being incredibly hawkish, then Tim Pool approves of her behavior. What an odd thing to have a consensus with Nancy Pelosi about. Saying that it's brave, it's respectful. She earned my respect by doing this. It's just, I don't know why. I mean, people in the Mises Caucus and libertarians should be blasting this out of the water. I mean, this is really something that we get almost everything right, but this is really something that we get right really well, and we need to be able to call it out and articulate it, especially when, this was like an international crisis in August doing this. So anyways, later in the July 28th video, Tim Pool specifically doubled down on his call for regime change on the mainland. And so I have the transcript up here
by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Here's what I want to see.
Here.
I want to see Taiwan unified with China. I really, really do. I want to see the Taiwanese government take over the Chinese government and an end to the Chinese Communist Party. Very different from what they're proposing. My proposal is an end to the Chinese Communist Party and a restoration of democracy and Republican values. I don't mean Republican Party. I'm talking about republicanism. The people electing true representatives and an end to the authoritarianism of the CCP.
So that is a direct call for regime change. I mean, I don't know what else it is. I don't know is he advocating that the U.S. should have a hand in this regime change? I mean, it's kind of implied from the context of his video and from what he's talking about and from his position as being a U.S. citizen, ostensibly. I mean, I believe he is. I don't know any differently, but this is a call for regime change. How is this any different from what Lindsey Graham says when he goes on Fox News and talks about how we need to overthrow Putin? And what would that mean, right? Now, Lindsey Graham, when pressed, he would say, this guy's got to go. Oh, but I think that the Russians should do it themselves. Right. Okay, sure, Lindsey Graham. Well, what is Tim Pool saying here, and what does he actually think about this? I mean, why should any American put as a priority the freedom of the Taiwanese people? What does the United States have to gain? What does the average American have to gain? I'm not talking about the U.S. empire, but what does the average American have to gain from this? I love being an American and I love America, but how does this make my small town better? The freedom of people in Taiwan. Bankrolling that freedom doesn't make Main Street better in my small town. Why should we care about that? And why should the U.S. ostensibly get involved in overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party? So a few days after Pool's July 28th segment, Nancy Pelosi did visit Taiwan. Predictably, her August 2nd junket sparked a diplomatic crisis, which risked boiling over into war, provoking days of unprecedented Chinese military drills around the island, the high point of which included a rocket barrage over Taiwan. Now, this would not have happened if Nancy Pelosi had stayed home. How does this help the people of Taiwan? At all. How? Standing in solidarity? I mean, did anyone ask the people of Taiwan if they thought it was a good idea for Nancy Pelosi to come make a symbolic visit that probably had little to zero substance about actual policy? There are certain signs that they reject this policy, that the Kuomintang, the opposition party, and ironically, the party that fled mainland China to establish a government in exile in Taiwan, actually now is against these provocative actions with the mainland. And they swept all of the regional elections after this Nancy Pelosi's visit. So just a sign that actual Taiwanese people don't like escalatory policy when it comes to China, to mainland China. Nonetheless, an endless parade of U.S. delegations to Taipei followed, marking an all but official repudiation of the One China policy, a principle that has underpinned U.S.-China ties since 1979. We've talked about this a lot on the podcast in the last few episodes. So, though Washington, like much of the rest of the world, has yet to formally recognize Taiwan as an independent country, its increasingly cozy relations with the island risks crossing one of China's brightest red lines. And there's a nice little link there that you can check out. A lesson from Ukraine. China's red lines on Taiwan shouldn't be ignored, by Dave DeCamp. So Biden has also escalated many of the same policies as his predecessors in regards to Taiwan, sending warships through the Taiwan Strait on a near monthly basis, just as Obama and Trump did before him. Moreover, under the current administration, American troops are openly deployed to the island to train local forces for war with the mainland. Though on 4 occasions the White House has attempted to explain away some remarks as gaffes, Biden has repeatedly stated the U.S. is renouncing the long-held policy of strategic ambiguity regarding whether or not U.S. forces would intervene in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Biden's most recent pledge came in late September of 22. Biden's most recent pledge came in late September of 22. In contrast to the first 3 pledges, the most recent statement will not be walked back, according to Kurt Campbell, Biden's top Asia official. Now, Beijing does prefer peaceful reunification to resolve the split that occurred at the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, but also has not ruled out using force to retake the territory, an outcome which aggressive U.S. policies only make more likely. And I linked to an American Conservative article by Peter Van Buren, who's a great resource on this topic. So as senior fellow at Defense Priorities and retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has explained, quote, "It is crucial to understand that for China, the Taiwan issue is not merely a core interest, but an emotionally charged one. They are far more willing to pay extraordinary costs, sacrifice many men, and could risk it all to eventually compel unification with Taiwan. The issue does not directly affect our national security unless we get involved. If we eventually choose war with China over Taiwan, we will at best suffer egregious losses in ships, aircraft, and troops. In a worst case, the war could deteriorate into a nuclear exchange in which American cities are turned into nuclear wastelands, killing millions. America should never take such risks unless our security and freedom are directly threatened. Fighting China for any reason short of that would be a foolish gamble of the highest order." The State Department recently approved a $1.1 billion weapons sale to Taipei, Biden's largest arms transfer to the island yet. Congress, meanwhile, will soon vote on a bill which would provide Taiwan with $6.5 billion, with the B, in military aid until 2027. It would make the island a de facto major non-NATO ally and accelerate further weapons sales. The provocative legislation, the Taiwan Policy Act of 22, would also require a, quote, robust anti-Beijing sanctions regime if the mainland is knowingly engaged in a significant escalation in aggression. This bill would, by design, eviscerate the One China policy, making a war over Taiwan, likely including the U.S., all but declared. So thankfully, the Taiwan Policy Act did not pass, and some of the most provocative language was taken out. But the rest of it was incorporated into the NDAA. I think it was a 2023 NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which delegated a lot of the spending increases. So the spending increases did pass, but a lot of the most provocative things like making the island a de facto major non-NATO ally, I don't think that passed or became part of the NDAA. And I'm not sure if the sanctions did, but at least, the part that would designate U.S. action in response to a Chinese aggressive act was not included. So it wasn't an official repudiation of the One China policy, which I think is very good that it didn't pass. But a lot of the bad stuff also was included in the NDA, all the finances and stuff. So further, Tim Pool's suggestion that the U.S. is headed for conflict with China, no matter what we do, reflects an air of fatalism that has permeated his news coverage over the last 3 years. And furthermore, this fatalism of inevitability, it is omnipresent in kind of the establishment thinking and writing about this topic. And it's so dangerous, thinking that, well, whatever we do, we're destined for war. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's complete bullshit. War is over if you want it. It could seem inevitable because there are levers that are turning the world that are beyond our control. So it could be from like a hapless perspective. From my perspective, it seems inevitable no matter what I do. But you shouldn't have that rhetoric being broadcast from, major commentators and the establishment, because it really, it solidifies public opinion that it's inevitable. And so I may privately feel like that. I think it's complete bullshit, like to roll over and die and just think, well, throw our hands up. We're just going to go to war with China and send our sons and daughters over there to die and risk nuclear fire. That's just the way it is. And that's what's going to happen. I just think it's not the way to approach this problem. It's not true, first of all, but it's not the way to approach this problem. from our standpoint, from anyone's standpoint, especially policymakers at the highest level. So further, Tim Pool often insinuates the inevitability of war by citing Thucydides' trap, which is a theory that states that when a rising power confronts a waning power, war is the probable result. So, of course, it's the ancient Greek philosopher Thucydides. His history, I think he's a historian, not a philosopher, but Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War is a foundational text in the field of international relations. It concerns the ancient historians' observations as to why the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta went to war in 431 BC. In Tim Pool's application of Thucydides' trap to U.S.-China relations, he forgets Thucydides' fundamental thesis, that the Peloponnesian War was caused by two major elements and not just one. If you ask Tim Pool, Thucydides' trap is one element. That would be the rapid rise of one power in the declining of another power. While the second element, and the most important element, is not just the rapid rise in the rising power, but it's the fear that the rapid rise causes in the waning power. So in Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, it was Athens that was rising rapidly, but Thucydides said that the war was caused not just by the rapid rise of Athens, but the fear that that rise caused in Sparta, which was the established power. And I'm just going to play a little bit from the source where I found that, because it's from Lyle Goldstein in an interview that he did. He's also a fellow at Defense Priorities, and he's also been interviewed several times about this on Scott Horton's show. All right, so I took this interview from the University of Washington School of Law Discovery Podcast episode with Lyle Goldstein. And again, he's the founding director of the China Maritime Studies Institute at the Naval War College. Here we go. And he works with Defense Priorities.
Because really the first text that we're given to study in the field of international relations is this great history by Thucydides of the Peloponnesian War. And what's so striking about this theorizing is the most critical sentence that every student of IR knows is that Thucydides suggests the main cause of this massive, devastating war between Athens and Sparta was a twofold: the rapid rise of Athens, that's on the one hand, and the fear that caused in Sparta. That's how Thucydides puts it. And really, it's not a leap to think about how the same conditions are operative today in the U.S.-China relationship. That is, China is rising very rapidly, probably beyond what most Americans can appreciate. I think that's quite true. I see that on the military side, where China has, in my view, exceeded our capabilities not in all areas, but in several areas that are disturbing. But it's also, on many other fronts. China is doing really impressive things on technology development, infrastructure development. But the other side of this, of course, of Thucydides' insight, it's not just the rapid rise of one power. It's also the fear that causes for the hegemonic power, which is obviously the United States here. And as I watch the discourse on China and China policy, which is rife with exaggeration and threat mongering, I do wonder if this is exactly what Thucydides was talking about.
And you talk about a lot of different potential flashpoints, and we're going to get into...
Okay. So you see there Lyle Goldstein talking about this. And one of the biggest problems that I have in general with Tim Pool's analysis is that, one, he only really understands or presents the one part of Thucydides' trap, when clearly there's that second element that I think is the most important one that Lyle Goldstein underlines. But furthermore, Tim, in his coverage, it's not just that he doesn't mention the other half, which is the fear, but he also adds to the fear and he sensationalizes things, which I also understand, is part of having a successful media channel, is that it's much easier, for clicks and revenue and things like that to hype things up. I try to do that sometimes in my own work. I don't think it's, I don't think that I don't purposefully exaggerate things, but sometimes I will include a snarky title just to get that additional click. But it really permeates a lot of Tim Pool's coverage. If you, I I have a bit of it in here, examples of it, but those segments that I played earlier as well. But instead, I write, Tim Pool has assisted in sensationalizing China's rise for the better part of 3 years at least, which may inadvertently on his part, I give him the benefit of the doubt here, may inadvertently on his part stoke a war. On March 23rd, 2021, Tim Pool said that the United States is, quote, facing quite possibly the biggest threat we have ever faced, a rising and despotic authoritarian Chinese Communist Party. In that same segment, he praised the Biden administration for imposing sanctions on China for claimed human rights abuses, saying, quote, it's about time we saw some action. All right, so I'm going to play that segment from Tim Pool's show. Now, granted, it's a couple years ago now, but here's what he says. I'll just play the whole first minute.
In what I can only hope is the right move, the Biden administration has joined the EU in sanctioning China over their mistreatment of Uyghur Muslims. For those that aren't familiar, China is operating concentration camps for a religious minority, and it's shocking and disgusting. And it's about time we saw some action. Now, in the past, I've said I think sanctions may be the right move. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a psychic. I just hope this makes sense, and I will say it outright. The culture war is damaging to U.S. interests. The fights that we have over critical race theory and social justice.
And he's also part of this like odd conservative theory that China is somehow behind the culture war, which I don't know if there's any actual evidence for that at all. That's not somehow connected by some circumstantial web. But I mean, the culture war is coming from, I guess they say, well, all of this progressive culture is coming from higher education, which is owned by China or some shit like that. I think in reality, it's, American universities, American professors that are captured by this, American liberals, American progressives that are behind a lot of like the politically correct social justice stuff. And furthermore, I mean, I think that conservatives themselves, although they're not really the most aggressive or instigating party, but they certainly wage the culture war and participate in it. So anyways.
Issues are important for a variety of reasons, but I fear they're tearing this country apart. And we must do everything we can to give credit where credit is due when things happen that are beneficial to all of us here in the United States and the world. For the longest time, China has gotten away with the mistreatment of the Uyghur Muslims, with the mistreatment of those in Hong Kong, and there are fears they will try to invade and seize Taiwan. And there are fears the Biden administration will not be strong enough to stop it.
See, that's exactly what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about, Biden, this narrative that Biden is feckless, that he's out to lunch, that he is, instead of the narrative being that, oh my God, this crazy out to lunch, like senile old man is sleepwalking us into, world war. It's no, he's weak and feckless. And only if he was stronger and more assertive, then we would avoid war by being more aggressive.
Recently saw peace talks break down. Chinese officials went on a 15-minute rant insulting the U.S., claiming that we here have serious human rights abuses and our interests are being undermined by the culture war in many different ways, from messaging around the world, putting us in a weak position, to dividing us at a time when we are facing quite possibly the biggest threat we have ever faced, a rising and despotic authoritarian Chinese Communist Party. Now, we're also seeing a movement to stop hate against Asians. And
yeah, so this, I was talking about the sensationalist coverage from Tim Pool. U.S. joins the EU in sanctioning China over Uyghur abuses, infuriating the Chinese Communist Party and Xi. It's not the worst thing that I've seen, but anyways. So you kind of get the picture. Not only in this video, he calls the Chinese Communist Party the largest threat the United States has ever faced, which is really kind of saying something. But he also praises U.S. aggressive action in the form of sanctions, which, sanctions, they don't hurt the moneyed interest in China. They don't hurt the Chinese government. They hurt common people in China. And specifically, they hurt the Uyghurs, which are the people that Tim Pool is talking about, because I'll get into it a bit more here. But everything that he cites just has the NED's fingerprints all over it. This basically the arm of the CIA that does overtly what the CIA used to do covertly. The National Endowment for Democracy, especially the Hong Kong protests and things like that, just have U.S. regime change fingerprints all over it. But furthermore, he called for regime change earlier. Just as recently as August, he called for regime change in China. So the Uyghur genocide narrative, is something that's not easy to talk about, especially since being critical of it certain is akin to being like some kind of a Holocaust denier or something like that. But it's so important to analyze these and to take on this claim, which is kind of the banner claim that Tim Pool has propagated on his show in regards to U.S.-China policy and about China specifically. And he's talked a lot about these claimed human rights abuses against the Uyghurs. So even though it's not sexy and it's not popular to talk about, being critical of this narrative is incredibly important. So that's why I had to have it in a primer about U.S.-China relations. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there. A flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker. Really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix. You can also get Vital Descent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Descent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldescent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldescent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at Pat McFarland_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. So the Uyghur genocide narrative, I write, of these human rights abuses, Tim Pool often claims that the Chinese Communist Party has imprisoned more than 1 million ethnic Uyghurs in concentration camps in an act of genocide involving institutionalized rape, systematic involuntary sterilization, and organ harvesting on an industrial scale. According to Tim Pool, the U.S. government is the only power that can stop these atrocities and should do something about it. That's what he said in that video I just played. So to support these claims, Tim Pool has repeatedly interviewed the cast of China Uncensored, a show whose YouTube channel has garnered the better part of 2 million subscribers. However, a little digging reveals that China Uncensored is a subsidiary of New Tang Dynasty, a news outlet operated and owned by a rabidly anti-China flying saucer cult named Falun Gong. The group's charismatic leader and founder Li Hongzhi has stated that he can levitate, walk through walls, quote, use his mind to direct and order things to happen, and that aliens have begun to invade the human mind and its ideology and culture. Now, that's a direct quote from a Time magazine interview with Li Hongzhi from 1999. Let's see. So here's that quote. Aliens have begun to invade the human mind and its ideology and culture. Where do they come from? Hongzhi says, the aliens come from other planets. The names that I use for these planets are different. The aliens have introduced modern machinery like computers and airplanes. Their ultimate purpose is to replace humans. Time magazine asks, are you a human being? He says, you can think of me as a human being. Time magazine says, are you from Earth? And he says, I don't wish to talk about myself at a higher level. People wouldn't understand it. So just really strange. And it's not directly to, discredit him. I mean, I guess I included to discredit him, but it doesn't mean de facto that everything he says is wrong, but it's just, you got to know where this stuff is coming from. So in Falun Gong's belief system, the practitioners receive the benefits of good health by having Fa energy implanted in their abdomen. And I'm not making that up either. This is just this is from their official website. I did like a full-length documentary about this.
Leave a little space between the teeth. Close the lips and gently shut the eyes. Maintain a serene expression on the separate the hands from better.
So if you
the left hand will remain up.
Watch through all of their stuff, they talk about, receiving the benefits of Fa energy through this wheel that's implanted in your abdomen, like absorbing the good vibes and stuff like that. So I'm not really familiar with Eastern religions to say how unhinged this kind of stuff is, but their main logo is a swastika, like a very blatant swastika. And I know swastikas have different meanings throughout the years, but it's just interesting. So go ahead and look into that. And I'll include a link to my documentary in the show notes page. So Falun Gong was expelled from China, and this is where their bias comes in. It's not just, discrediting them because of their wacky beliefs. But it is this explicit motive to lie that I think is the most important thing. So Falun Gong was expelled from China in 1999. Shortly thereafter, Li Hongzhi fled to a 400-acre compound in upstate New York, where he established Falun Gong's international headquarters. Members of the group own and operate New Tang Dynasty and another large media outlet, the Epoch Times, where they receive direct orders from Li Hongzhi himself. And if you go through this is at their website, the transcript from a teaching where Li Hongzhi addressed the staff of the Epoch Times, telling them basically to infiltrate the U.S. media and to become regular media and to bring about the downfall of the Chinese Communist Party. He says, of course, there is another factor involved. Though the people of mainland China have become quite awful after having had their thinking ruined by the wicked CCP and their moral values have bottomed out, and despite the fact that society is a real wreck, in that place are truly indeed many reincarnated kings from each and every ethnic group and era. He says, you all know about the mischief that secret agents of the wicked CCP make outside of China. When you work on soliciting advertisements, they make calls to try to ruin the deal. When these thugs do that one time, there will be one dose of karmic retribution. And if the sin is great, the payback will be bitter. That's especially true when you meet the challenges. You need to clarify the truth then and help people to see the true face of the CCP gang. As long as that rogue regime is still causing trouble, you have to do an even more solid job of exposing it. Those agents of the CCP are nothing really. What's behind them are possessing rotten demons that were arranged by the old forces, with the goal being to test whether the world's people could be saved. So you kind of see him telling, and he talks about NTD as well. It's not sufficient for the Epoch Times to just break even, though, and you haven't thought about how to do better, how to become a regular enterprise that will enable you to have an even greater impact in saving sentient beings and clarifying the truth. That's what I've been thinking, and the same holds true for NTD, New Tang Dynasty. A while ago, I told them that they should maintain a stable sales and marketing staff and pay those people a salary, and that it's okay if the pay is a little low. You need to make sure that those students' lives are stable so that they can do this work with full focus. That's what they are now doing, and I've heard that it has gone very well. If you really want to see your paper do even better and have a greater impact, then you too can try that approach if conditions permit and see how it goes. And he calls the Epoch Times a Falun Dafa. That's what they call themselves, Falun Dafa, a Falun Dafa project. And so you can see this link between NTD, New Tang Dynasty, the Epoch Times, and Li Hongzhi and Falun Gong. So he calls them the disciples of Dafa. So, and these members of China Uncensored are New Tang Dynasty. There was if you go to their website, if you go to their YouTube channel, their official tag ends China Uncensored NTD. It ends with NTD. Let's see. Little digging. So here's the video that you can watch for yourself here, where Nathan Rich basically exposes
might as well try
that China Uncensored is a project of New Tang Dynasty.
Oh, what do you know? The name NTD, China Uncensored, pulls up your channel. And that's because the username of your channel is, for some reason, NTD China Uncensored. And now that I think about it, didn't I see NTD all over the place in your video descriptions? Weird. That is so weird. But anyway, sorry, go on, Chris.
Right now, we're trying to save money by recording this show in a low-budget way, which happens to be a green screen taped to the wall of Matt's living room.
Right now, you're shooting in a living room. Right now, like for this particular video. You know, Chris, I totally believe you that you guys shoot in a living room. And that's beneath you. Maybe you should try using a studio for this kind of thing. Here, I'll help you find one. Let's start by looking where, I don't know, New Tang Dynasty is located. 229 West 28th Street, New York, New York, 10001. Oh, here we go. There is a studio there called Big Apple Studios at the exact same address. They do work for various Falun Gong organizations, part of the propaganda apparatus. Well, anyway, you're welcome for helping you find them. Oh, hang on. It looks like you do use this studio after all. Or wait, is that you?
Good evening and welcome to the Big Apple Studios. I'm your host, Jason Smith.
Weird. So weird that you use NTD in your channel name and you use a studio in the same building as NTD. And who is this small team you mentioned earlier anyway? You've got credits on this video, the one talking about how you have nothing to do with NTD or Falun Gong. Let's see here. Your team is Shelly Zhang, Matt Gneizda, Seamus Light, and Chris Chappell. Okay, so just 4 people, none of which are New Tang Dynasty Falun Gong death cultists. Shelly Zhang. Where do I know that name from? I feel like it came up during my research somewhere. Oh, that's right. I know it from here, from New Tang Dynasty. Producer? That's weird, Chris. Oh, and Matt Gneizda? Oh, he's from New Tang Dynasty. China analyst. Oh, I'm sure he's really insightful.
So yeah, he basically, Nathan Rich goes on to prove that all these people are New Tang Dynasty. And they're the exact same people who are behind China Uncensored's YouTube channel. And they have appeared on Tim Pool's show, Timcast IRL, several times, like 3 or 4, maybe 5 times. And they actually brought up Falun Gong several times on the show, and they just get on and they fearmonger about China over and over again. And Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski basically accept uncritically everything that they have to say. Don't ask them any tough questions or hardball follow-up questions about anything like that, and bring them on as being people who have some kind of an authority on this subject. Don't question them at all about their links to New Tang Dynasty, to Falun Gong, or basically any of those things. Ask them about any bias that they might have because they are employed or work at an organization that is owned by members of this cult that receive direct orders from the leader of this cult. And it just basically goes, these are legitimate China people. They don't have any bias, or, these are the people to look towards when you want your China coverage. So here's one, and I don't know if this is the same one. No, this is a different one. So that's Matt Gneizda talking about organ harvesting right here.
So they're attracting Middle Eastern customers they're very ethical customers who only want halal organs from Muslims.
Talking
Ethical,
about
very ethical.
China
They
selling
want the halal
organs
Yeah,
in a mass market to people in the Middle East.
Innocent Muslim as well.
It's unclear if the people getting the organs, how much they know. There's a certain degree of willing.
I don't know. I don't want to know.
Yeah, like it is not possible.
So I don't know if, what kind of coverage people are really expecting there. But anyways, so that's Falun Gong. So although the cast of China Uncensored repeatedly mentioned Falun Gong on Timcast IRL, Tim Pool may not know about the connections between China Uncensored, New Tang Dynasty, and the fringe religious organization. But they did mention Falun Gong on the show, and there weren't really any follow-up questions about possible connections between Falun Gong and China Uncensored. So many of the claims Tim Pool makes regarding the alleged genocide of the Uyghurs have been addressed more fully elsewhere. These are a few articles that I did. Independent Media parrots questionable Uyghur genocide claims, where I address this more fully. And this is the Gray Zone did a whole bunch of reporting on this that you can find about specifically the people behind all of these peer-reviewed articles about it. Peer-reviewed, I say in quotes. But they often rely on sources. So these claims of Uyghur genocide, they often rely on sources linked to U.S. intelligence, including Radio Free Asia and the World Uyghur Congress, and utilize testimony from Chinese defectors sourced by these organizations. And these defectors constantly change their stories. Other sources cited to support the Uyghur genocide narrative include defense industry think tanks such as the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the New Lines Institute, the Jamestown Foundation, and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. The last of which is a notorious Cold War agitprop organization co-founded by avowed regime change architect Zbigniew Brzezinski. So even the above organizations have avoided claims that Uyghurs are being mass murdered by the CCP outright because there's no evidence to suggest that. Without evidence to support the extermination narrative, these special interests attempted to prove the Chinese government was preventing the births of Uyghurs in a, quote, demographic genocide. By 2022, after nearly every Western-aligned news outlet by 2022, after nearly every Western-aligned news outlet published as fact a fraudulent study purporting to prove demographic genocide, this narrative too was mostly abandoned. For those claiming genocide, it did not and does not help that the Uyghur population is actually growing and not shrinking. As for the study itself, it turns out all changes in the Uyghur birth rates can be explained by a shifting one-child policy, which until July 2017 applied to Han Chinese but not Uyghurs, and improved access to family planning. these are all things that would be heralded as supporting human rights by the progressive left. You know, you can just see if we were able to take an entire demographic of our population that didn't have access to birth control and family planning, you would see how the progressive left immediately would champion that as like a huge success of modern health, like modern healthcare. It's just ridiculous. So these allegations were embraced by the Biden administration. And I believe Lyle Goldstein, as an aside, I believe he said that these allegations of genocide are so blatantly laughable and ridiculous that it's actually a disservice to actual victims of genocide. Like, you know, I think the example he used was victims of the Holocaust or something like that. So these allegations of genocide were embraced by the Biden administration, which then doubled down on targeted economic sanctions with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this is what Tim Pool was praising in that video I played earlier, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is not going to hurt the CCP in any regard, but it will hurt industry and standards of living in Xinjiang, which is the province where these Uyghurs live. They're the largest, I think they're the largest demographic in Xinjiang. But those are the people that this is going to hurt, the people that Tim Pool is claiming are victims. So this legislation, it took effect on June 21st of last year. The act created basically a rebuttable presumption that all goods, quote, mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part in Xinjiang or by an entity on the Forced Labor Prevention Act entity list are prohibited from the U.S. importation under federal law. These accusations of forced labor stem from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and the Washington, D.C. based Center for Strategic and International Studies. So these are hawkish think tanks. Tim Pool praised these sanctions in the above cited March 23rd, 21 segment. The penalties have the effect of suppressing all industry in Xinjiang, regardless of its impact on average citizens and regardless of the impact that it has on their alleged mistreatment. So further crucial context, and the reason I say that basically is, you know, we know from the sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s that, you know, Madeleine Albright admitted in an interview, she accepted the number as fact that the interview put out there, that 500,000 Iraqi children had died as a direct result of U.S. sanctions. So we're supposed to sit here and applaud sanctions that are basically affect the standard of living of people that we're claiming are being genocided. It just doesn't make sense. So further crucial context omitted by Tim Pool and his guests is that nationalist Uyghur terrorism has plagued Xinjiang for decades. So this is not mentioned at all. And it doesn't excuse whatever mistreatment that the Uyghurs are having, because it does appear that there is a anti-terrorism campaign, which, I mean, you can equate to the U.S. war of terror, right? The U.S. war on terror, but basically the domestic surveillance state of the anti-terror Bush regime. That's essentially, it seems like that's what's going on in Xinjiang, and not some mass internment and Holocaust style, genocide that's going on. So not to say it excuses it, but it explains it, and it's crucial it's crucial to understand, it's crucial context to understand as to what may or may not be happening. So it's omitted by Tim Pool and his guests. I've never heard him talk about Uyghur terrorism. That nationalist Uyghur terrorism has plagued Xinjiang for decades. Now I linked to a piece here. Oh. Anyways, the link doesn't work, but it's to university. Let's see if it works. Bullshit. As noted by Chris Zambellis of West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, quote, since the 1990s, Beijing has implicated a number of Uyghur organizations in terrorism, including bombings, arson attacks, assassinations, and abductions in Xinjiang and other parts of China, the largest of which, the Urumqi riots, resulted in the deaths of approximately 197 plus people, mostly Han Chinese, so not mostly Uyghurs. And this is where, there were huge riots where Uyghurs were brandishing swords, running around Urumqi, chopping people to bits. I mean, it's just brutal. Not that it excuses any kind of mistreatment, but it does, again, it explains what might be happening in a way that's more benign than just, the Chinese woke up one day and just decided they wanted to genocide an entire population of people. So because of this history of extremism, the CCP does, quote, de-radicalize Uyghurs it suspects of extremism. And those are sarcastic quotes. As part of this campaign, many Uyghurs do appear to be unjustly and arbitrarily detained in jail-like facilities. If the CCP is to be believed, and again, you got to take them for their word, which might not be easy, the detainees are taught vocational skills and are assimilated into Han culture before being released. It's a de-radicalization regime. But according to the UN's own documents, the average period of detention lasts around 2 to 18 months for Uyghurs that are put in these de-radicalization camps, facilities, camps, I don't know. However you want to term them without some kind of politically charged buzzword. Despite claims by the media and special interest groups, it is impossible to know to any degree of certainty the number of Uyghurs detained, their actual length of detainment, the conditions of these camps, and their treatment in these facilities. We just don't know. Furthermore, whoever's claiming that something is happening has the burden of proof to prove that it is happening, and it's not supported by the evidence, if you actually look. So in June 22, an unnamed source leaked ostensible CCP documents to the defense think tank's named China expert. His name is Adrian Zenz, the author of the aforementioned fraudulent report, and he is a Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation senior fellow. These documents purport to prove crimes against humanity by evidencing repressive Uyghur policies. They ostensibly consist of internal speeches by CCP officials, training procedures for jail staff, and thousands of pictures of detainees. Ironically, the facility's procedures were not much more barbaric than what you'd find in any American county jail or prison, much less in Guantanamo Bay, where the U.S. infamously detained and tortured Uyghur terrorists themselves. So these same people that we're claiming to shed crocodile tears over, the U.S. actually and documentedly detained and tortured Uyghur terrorists. So indeed, when it comes to counterterrorism operations, the CCP originally modeled its behavior after ours. And actually, I linked to a piece here of China's support for our war on terror from October 19th of 2001. Basically, the Chinese talking about supporting our anti-terrorism efforts and modeling our behavior. So it's just ridiculous. So, some of the things that are in the, what do they call it? I forget the name, what they called the documents, what Adrian Zenz called these documents. The Xinjiang files or something, the Xinjiang police files or something like that. But essentially what the document showed was, okay, what are we going to do in the event that there's a riot and a bunch of these prisoners escape? Well, we're going to shoot them. That was part of the documents. And that's not any different than U.S. policy. I pulled, in researching this, I pulled written jail policies from like a prison policy from, Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. It wasn't that specific one, but it is actually their policy that if a prisoner is escaping and you tell them to stop and they don't stop, you can shoot them. So anyways, so more recently when the office, so this happened last summer, I believe, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights published a highly politicized report on the conditions in Xinjiang after the commissioner visited there and spent, I think, a week or two in Xinjiang inspecting these facilities and asking officials in the area what exactly was going on. She wrote a report about this, and I linked to the report so you can read it yourself. But the final report declined to make any concrete findings. Nonetheless, its inconclusive remarks cited the same special interest groups behind the original Uyghur abuse claims to say, quote, crimes against humanity may be occurring. So that's inconclusive, essentially. It didn't conclusively claim anything. And furthermore, it heavily cited documents by these think tanks that are biased, they have their own motives. They're hawkish think tanks. And you would think that there would be more citations if the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights actually went to Xinjiang, toured these facilities, and had open access to the official documents and personnel, authorities from the CCP, that she would be able to make more conclusive results, or at least cite these documents or say what they are and what they say. So much like the earlier reports, eyewitness interviews were not subjected to cross-examination, were conducted remotely, were not evaluated by a fact-finding body, and were not made under threat of perjury. So the report includes some interviews with eyewitnesses, but if you actually go into the footnotes like I did, you see that these eyewitnesses were interviewed remotely because of COVID-19, that there was no there was no corroboration of who they were, where they were, what they experienced. There was no cross-examination, which is like a foundational legal sieve to sort through fact and bullshit. So none of this would really stand up. I don't think it really shows much of anything. You can't really evaluate what these people are saying because you don't have the tools to do so. But neither was the investigation's witnesses' methodology provided, as I just said. We have no idea who they are, how they were selected, who selected them, who they're associated with, or where they are currently located, or where they were even located at the time of the interview. So, as is every ruthless terror campaign, China's mistreatment of its Uyghur population is condemnable to the extent that it exists. However, there is little to no credible evidence of genocide, demographic or otherwise. There is also little credible evidence of institutionalized rape and organ harvesting. The latter claim always originated from Falun Gong. So you go and you see New Tang Dynasty, China Uncensored on Tim Pool's show. These claims of organ harvesting they were talking about on the show have always come from Falun Gong. They are the originators of this theory, of this story, this organ harvesting claim that Tim Pool talks about pretty much every time he talks about China, is this organ harvesting story. So the evidence that does exist supporting the Uyghur genocide narrative is largely sourced by special interest groups funded by U.S. intelligence agencies and Western defense think tanks. Moreover, the CIA is long rumored to have recruited and trained Uyghur Muslims for clandestine operations throughout the Middle East. In interviews with Libertarian Institute Director Scott Horton in November 2008 and April 2009, journalist Eric Margulies said that he witnessed Uyghur Muslims being trained in Afghanistan by Osama bin Laden and the Pakistani ISI with the knowledge and support of the CIA for the purpose of destabilizing China. And I have the exact interviews linked here. Colonel Larry Wilkerson, who served as chief of staff to George W. Bush's Secretary of State Colin Powell, claimed in a 2018 speech that up to 20,000 Chinese Uyghurs had fought on the side of al-Qaeda in Idlib, Syria. Several Chinese authorities believed that these Uyghur forces were invited there by Turkey, which is a NATO ally. So in the same 2018 speech, and remember how we talked earlier about how NATO wanted to confront China and had been talking about that? So in the same 2018 speech, Colonel Wilkerson speculated what a coherent U.S. strategy in Afghanistan might look like, saying that it would have three major components. The first would be to station hard military power in an extraordinarily inaccessible region of the world, an area located near the center of China's land-based Belt and Road Initiative. The second would be to maintain armed forces next to what is potentially the world's most unstable nuclear stockpile in Pakistan. But third, and most interestingly, Larry Wilkerson suggested that keeping a military force in position to protect CIA operations in Xinjiang province in the event a hot war ever broke out. So he suggested that that would be the third most interesting to me reason to keep U.S. forces in Afghanistan, would be to protect CIA operations in Xinjiang if a hot war were to break out with China. I continue. Many of the 12 to 13 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang already dislike the Han Chinese, and ethnic tensions. These are ethnic tensions the CIA could potentially exploit to destabilize the region from within. And actually, since I originally wrote this, I'm not quite sure that Uyghurs in Xinjiang largely dislike the Han Chinese. I mean, I think there's certainly elements of that, and sometimes it spirals out of control. But I would be wary of any like CIA narrative or State Department narrative that Chinese Uyghurs are all separatists and that they all hate the Chinese Communist Party. I just don't know that that's true, and I would be suspicious of that statement. So I actually don't like that I included that. But you could see that at least an element is there. Many of them, or some of them, dislike the Han Chinese. There really is a separatist movement there. The East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, is the name of the terrorist group that the CIA had on their terrorist watch list, but then took off. But when revisiting the subject in an April 2nd, 2021 interview, Larry Wilkerson said that the process might already be underway for the CIA to destabilize Xinjiang using these Uyghur terrorists that fought in Syria. According to official sources, Uyghurs who fought on the side of al-Qaeda in Syria are returning to Xinjiang, and this is in 21, so it's a couple years ago. Some have already arrived. China is reportedly very concerned, or the CCP is reportedly very concerned, as these are trained and experienced jihadist terrorists, at least as China sees it. There are unconfirmed rumors that Turkey and the U.S. might be aiding Uyghur jihadists through Afghanistan and into Xinjiang. Colonel Wilkerson ominously concluded that those Islamist fighters are not headed back home, quote, to bake cake. So I have linked that interview there. And I don't have a timestamp in it, but it's in here. You'll see it there. Ultimately, the State Department's support for the Uyghur diaspora has more to do with sabotaging China's international credibility and domestic stability than it does any real humanitarian concerns for the Uyghur people. The State Department doesn't give two shits about Uyghurs. They're a tool. They're a tool to the U.S. State Department, just like any other regime change operation or attempt that the CIA has ever conducted across the globe in its, almost 100-year history now of the CIA trying to topple regimes all across the world. They don't give two rips about Uyghurs at all. They're just using them, and that's sickening. It's more sickening, or almost or just as sickening as a person who knows that the Uyghurs are being genocided but deny it. It's just as sickening as that. Some people who have actual knowledge that this is occurring but continue to deny it. So anyways, there's little to no real evidence, and the evidence that does exist is presented by these State Department connected think tanks, weapon manufacturers, you name it, regime change fronts. But why must Tim Pool and his audience consider the above counterfactuals about the Uyghurs? It's incredibly important. It's about that fear, the fear and hatred we talked about with Thucydides' trap. But furthermore, the answer is simple. Aside from Taiwanese independence, the Uyghur genocide narrative lends moral credibility to any future military action against China, much like stories of weapons of mass destruction, incubator babies, and babies on bayonets did in past conflicts elsewhere in the world. Its scrutiny is exponentially important as America stumbles toward hot war with the PRC. So we have to look into this. We can't be afraid of being called genocide deniers or anything like that, as long as we follow the evidence and look at this soberly. Because in truth, it's impossible to determine exactly what is happening there from where we're sitting right now as Americans. Now, if maybe we could go to Xinjiang, I would love to go to Xinjiang and look around and see exactly what's happening. And if I did and I went there, I would tell the truth. But unfortunately, I don't have the means right now to go ahead and do that. So as Americans, we cannot say with any degree of certainty what is going on in Xinjiang. Even if we could, there's nothing our government can do about it that will not make the problem significantly worse for all parties involved. And Tim Pool's got to consider this information and look at his sources and ask China Uncensored what their connections are to Falun Gong and what Falun Gong's connection is to this Uyghur genocide narrative, and talk about all these reports that he just cites as fact that really don't hold up to scrutiny. And furthermore, libertarians who go on Tim Pool's show need to know about this so that they can talk about it with him and engage with him on it with some kind of authority. So the final section here, China's influence abroad. Tim Pool often argues that the CCP is encouraging world governments to be more authoritarian by exerting its growing economic power over them. Tim Pool's analysis, however, takes for granted the success of its dubious centrally planned projects. For starters, the PRC is communist in name only. Economically, China is no more socialist than any Western country. In 1999, the late Justin Raimondo described the complete reversal of Chinese communism during the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. Justin writes, since the death of Mao in 1979 and the ascension of Deng Xiaoping as China's new, quote, great helmsman, China has shed Marxist orthodoxy in all but the formal sense. Far from promoting Marxist ideology or serving as the center of a revived worldwide commie conspiracy, the Chinese Communist Party is presiding over the largest scale destatization process ever attempted. In, quote, constructing socialism with Chinese characteristics, as they put it, the heirs of Mao and the Long March are systematically dismantling the economic foundations of socialism, selling off state industries, not only allowing but actively soliciting foreign investment, privatizing land, cutting back on the military, setting up special economic zones in which the deadening hand of the party and the bureaucracy is stayed and the market allowed to flourish virtually unhampered. These and a host of other radical measures have effectively abolished the economic dictatorship of the party and the state. The dour spirit of Maoist egalitarianism, which exhorted China to, quote, put politics in command, has given way to a new form of socialism, in quotes, summed up by Deng in a famous maxim, quote, to get rich is glorious. So despite these free market triumphs of, quote, socialism with Chinese characteristics, it is the policies that depart from this successful approach that Tim Pool appears most concerned with. For instance, Tim Pool's talked a lot about the Belt and Road Initiative and China's predatory lending practices against other sovereign nations. And again, predatory lending practices, I put in quotes. The main policy that Tim Pool cites, the Belt and Road Initiative, is a massive centrally planned project that seeks to build an economic corridor from East Asia to Western Europe and Africa through the Middle East via, quote, a land and maritime network. The project suffers, however, from the hubris that any giant government project has. Without the profit loss motive, and this is Mises' insight, the CCP has no incentive to ensure a return on investments it paid for by wildly inflating its currency. Even the Western foreign policy establishment admits that the Belt and Road Initiative is, quote, a mess without any strategic objectives that has, quote, led to poorly conceived and managed projects and substantial negative economic, political, social, and environmental consequences. As for Tim Pool's arguments about China's predatory lending practices, the establishment outlet Foreign Policy had this to say. And the reason why I'm including what the establishment has to say is because I think the establishment benefits from threat inflation. And so if the establishment benefits from threat inflation, which it uses to sell weapons and to escalate policy and to increase the military budget, their incentive would be to, of course, say that fearmonger in the same way that Tim Pool kind of does, or at least that he also inflates the threat. And I guess I'm not accusing him of doing it intentionally because I have no evidence to suggest that, but he does it nonetheless. So this threat inflation is not practiced by these establishment outlets regarding things that Tim Pool always talks about and tries to, at least it has the effect, intended or otherwise, of freaking people out and stoking this China confrontationalism. As for Poole's arguments about China's predatory lending practices, the establishment outlet Foreign Policy had this to say, quote, Beijing is supposedly deliberately luring poor countries into unsustainable debts to finance infrastructure projects, enabling China to seize these assets when recipients experience debt distress, extending China's strategic reach. As Secretary of State Rex Tillerson lambasted the BRI's predatory economics, while Vice President Pence accuses Beijing of using debt trap diplomacy in Sri Lanka to establish a, quote, forward military base for China's growing Blue Water Navy. As our report shows, this is simply untrue. This whole narrative misunderstands China and ignores the interests and agency of recipient countries. As for the Sri Lankan case study, the report that I just quoted, cited by Foreign Policy, specifically concluded. So there was a report cited by Foreign Policy to say the BRI is complete garbage, disaster. And this report, the underlying report, concluded, and I quote, this chapter has disproven the debt trap diplomacy claims surrounding the Hambantota port. China did not propose the port. The project was overwhelmingly driven by Sri Lankan actors for their own domestic purposes, with some input from a Chinese SOE acting for commercial reasons. Sri Lanka's debt trap was thus primarily created as a result of domestic policy decisions and was facilitated by Western lending and monetary policy and not by the policies of the Chinese government. China's aid to Sri Lanka involved facilitating investment, not a debt for asset swap. The story of Hambantota Port is, in reality, a narrative of political and economic incompetence, facilitated by lax governance and inadequate risk management on both sides. So here's my conclusion, and it's pretty quick. Avoiding Thucydides' trap. So with tensions over Taiwan at their boiling point, Tim Pool, his audience, and all Americans must hear the uncomfortable truth about our relationship with China before it's too late. The supposed China threat has been inflated by our own politicians as a scapegoat for poor domestic policy. U.S. jobs were regulated to China by politicians here at home. Critical race theory is being taught by American progressives on TikTok and in American universities where the ideology originates. It is our woke military, in quotes, that has encircled China and is projecting force in China's near abroad. Thucydides cited both the rapid rise of Athens and the fear it caused in Sparta as the cause of the Peloponnesian War. War with China would be a global catastrophe. Such a conflict would almost certainly involve Russia. It could quickly go nuclear, which is an escalation that would likely end the human race. Even if the war remained conventional, tens if not hundreds of millions could die in grotesque and ruthless combat. Because of our economic interdependence, global standards of living would plummet. For most of the world, life would never be the same. We must not allow this to occur. That means not inflating, but rather understanding China's rise and putting it in its proper context. So, and again, I don't agree with the characterization from, I'm not entirely concerned about critical race theory. I mean, it's all culture war stuff, and I just don't really give a fuck about it. But CRT is there. It's being taught in American universities by Americans who came up with it. If you buy into the culture war and you think that it's worth your time and effort fighting about it, and further, detracting from who the real enemy is, which is the establishment, you care about those things. Don't blame China, because that's what the establishment wants. And furthermore, our military isn't woke. I mean, you're talking about the same military that basically executed an entire family in the last days of Afghanistan via drone strike, killing, 7 kids and their father. I don't think saying that they're woke, it really detracts from, the fact that they're murderous, bloodthirsty killers. I mean, it doesn't really add anything to the conversation other than maybe the fact that you think that they need to be more ruthless and bloodthirsty and not effeminate and basically ineffective trans people, speaking like a true conservative. So, all right. So a lot of the stuff I talked about with the Uyghurs, I put into a featured documentary called Stain of the Century. If you want to get more detailed information on that, where I go into more detail. It's actually shorter than this episode was, but this is my China primer. So if should be a one-stop shop to get you up to speed on everything, basically the most important parts about our Cold War with China. And I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I know it went a little bit long, but it's a complicated topic. If you are a libertarian who goes on Tim Pool's show, I would exhort you to watch this and to read my article that I'll link in the show notes page, what I would tell Tim Pool about our Cold War with China, what Tim Pool should know about our Cold War with China. So again, just me humbly saying that if you're a libertarian that goes on Tim Pool's show, you should read this and confront him with it. And if Tim Pool ever watches this, please, I would love to talk to you about it on your show if you would have me. Would really appreciate it. And I think that your audience would be interested in these facts. And I think that you should be too. So again, vitaldissent.com/251 is where you can find the show notes page. Head on over to the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org. Kyle Matovic just put out a great article that I helped him edit, or at least I, gave feedback to, on Steve Bannon and his connections to a Chinese dissident billionaire named Miles Guo. I think it's really interesting. It's a great article. So check that out, libertarianinstitute.org, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks.